Boa tarde a todos, senhoras e senhores, autoridades presentes nesse dispositivo virtual, audiência dos canais virtuais, sejam todos bem-vindos. Este evento está sendo transmitido pelo canal da USP no YouTube. Presentes nesse dispositivo, temos o professor Dr. Varran Gopian, magnífico reitor da Universidade de São Paulo, os organizadores, professor Dr. Amâncio Jorge Oliveira, vice-diretor do Museu Paulista e docente do Instituto de Relações Internacionais, a professora doutora Ana Estela Haddad, da Faculdade de Odontologia, professor doutor Bruno Caramelli, suplente representante dos professores associados no Conselho Universitário da Faculdade de Medicina, professor doutor Luiz Fernando Ramos, da Escola de Comunicações e Artes, e o professor Dr. Marcílio Alves, da Escola Politécnica da USP, representante dos professores associados no Conselho Universitário. Para as palavras de boas-vindas, convidamos o professor Dr. Marcílio Alves, representante dos professores associados no Conselho Universitário.
Boa tarde a todos, a todas que estão nos ouvindo, tanto aqui presencialmente no canal Zoom, quanto no canal YouTube. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos aqui e aproveitar e contar um pouquinho aí em 5, 10 minutos da história do nosso evento e dizer que ele nasceu assim de uma necessidade detectada por vários docentes de que nós possamos ter uma voz dentro de toda a estrutura hierárquica da Universidade de São Paulo. A gente detecta que é difícil, né, encontrar, a gente poder falar as nossas opiniões, e são tantas as nossas opiniões que a gente tem sobre todos os assuntos, né, sobre ensino, sobre os modos de ensinar, sobre pesquisa, sobre toda a parte da conexão entre a universidade e a sociedade. E a gente, então, ao detectar isso, começou a criar esse congresso, inicialmente já estamos na 5ª versão, e com os representantes do CO, dos associados e dos titulares à época, tinha a professora Simone, tinha o professor Bafa, o professor Geraldo, o professor Amâncio, e esse grupo foi se modificando, e agora temos esse grupo atual, que eu já vou depois nomeá-los e agradecê-los, que já organiza esse encontro já há 3 anos, né, juntos como grupo. E se vocês se lembram, muitos devem se lembrar, o ano passado nós tivemos a presença do professor Manuel Castells, como um convidado externo, especial, também com a abertura do encontro feita pelo professor Varran, nosso reitor, como mais tarde ele vai também estar aqui, e já está aqui, mas vai estar fazendo a abertura oficial, e desta feita a gente convidou o professor Michael Sandel. Ele é um professor de Harvard, eu já expliquei isso lá nos nossos sites, né? Mas ele vai falar sobre um tema assim um conceito muito invocado em toda a estrutura universitária, que é o mérito, né? E nós precisamos entender um pouquinho mais o que é o mérito e perguntar para o professor Sandel por que ele fala que é tirano esse conceito, né? A tirania do mérito é o subtítulo do livro dele, de título Meritocracia. Então, tudo isso faz assim um caldeirão, né, de ideias que a gente gostaria de estar falando, e conceitos, etc. Então, esse espaço nos parece que é um espaço assim apropriado, né? É lógico que é uma vez ao ano, etc., mas ele dá ensejo também a reuniões menores entre docentes, a conversas, etc., que a gente acredita, então, está fazendo um papel agregador assim para a Universidade de São Paulo. E nesse sentido, assim, como eu já falei o nome da Universidade de São Paulo, uma das coisas que eu gostaria de agradecer, e que às vezes a gente acaba esquecendo, né? A gente agradece muitas pessoas, mas a gente às vezes se perde em agradecer as instituições. E a Universidade de São Paulo é aquela que está nos proporcionando esse espaço de discussão. Então, eu preciso dar um agradecimento especial a essa instituição, né, que, no caso, hoje está sendo representada pelo professor Varran, na qualidade de reitor. Então, também já agradeço também a presença e o comprometimento, né, do professor Varran com esse encontro. Como eu disse, que ele já participou nos anteriores, e sempre tem nos apoiado. Então, é motivo também de agradecimento. E quando eu agradeço à USP, eu agradeço também aos seus funcionários, aos seus estudantes e a todos os seus docentes. Não poderia deixar de agradecer ao professor Sandel, né? O professor Sandel é ser muito requisitado mediaticamente, ele é uma pessoa muito importante, né? Então, ele se dispôs assim, a estar participando desse encontro com uma palestra, e que vai ser uma palestra um pouco diferente, no sentido de que ele vai dar uma introdução ao tema, mas vai esperar um certo debate, que vai ser coordenado pelo professor Amâncio e pela professora Elizabeth Balbachevski, a quem eu também agradeço. Agradeço também ao professor Renato Janine Ribeiro, que ele vai estar coordenando uma das mesas que vai ser formadas, uma das salas, né, a partir desse encontro aqui, ainda hoje, né, ele vai estar trabalhando junto com o professor Bruno Caramelli sobre o tema estrutura de poder. E o outro tema, outra sala que a gente escolheu foi o tema USP Sociedade, é um tema muitíssimo importante nessa época de pandemia, vai ser coordenada pela professora Ana Estela e pelo professor José Krieger, a quem também agradeço aqui especialmente. Bom, também agradeço a todos, né, que estão participando desse encontro hoje. A gente sabe que esses encontros virtuais, eles são, assim, têm se tornado, assim, cansativos, né, porque a gente tem trabalhado muito, todos os docentes, todos os alunos, né, têm reclamado dessa carga extra de trabalho devido à pandemia. Então, estarem presente aqui também é motivo de nosso agradecimento. Mas eu não poderia deixar de agradecer ao Amâncio, à Ana Estela, ao Luiz e ao Bruno, que por detrás dos bastidores, gestando ao longo de meses, a gente está trabalhando aqui nesse congresso, nessa organização, para poder proporcionar para vocês, né, docentes da USP, o melhor ambiente possível desse encontro. Então, agradeço a vocês. E então encerra aqui a minha participação nessa fase inicial do encontro. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, professor Marcílio. Anunciamos agora as palavras do professor Dr. Varran Agopian, magnífico reitor da Universidade de São Paulo.
Obrigado, Silvia. Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Realmente é uma satisfação participar desses encontros. O Marcílio fez um rápido apanhado dessa realidade. De fato, começou com uma aspiração dos representantes das categorias docentes no Conselho Universitário, que acharam importante trocar ideias com seus colegas. Começaram com esses encontros e acabou se tornando um encontro de sucesso, e é muito importante os docentes conversarem entre si, compartilharem experiências, compartilharem dificuldades e verem, agora vocês vão ter hoje a oportunidade de falar com o professor Michael Sandel, pontos de vista diferentes do que nós estamos acostumados a ter no seu dia a dia. Eu parabenizo a comissão organizadora pela iniciativa. Acho que dos originais sobrou o Marcílio e o Amâncio só. Não estou chamando vocês de velhos, estou falando da equipe original, mas agora está com o apoio da Ana Estela, do Bruno Caramelli e do Luiz Fernando. Então, parabéns pela iniciativa. E o encontro é virtual, pode ser realmente, com isso nós perdemos o calor humano, nós perdemos a oportunidade dessas conversas paralelas, esses contatos. Mas, por outro lado, nós temos um alcance maior, Marcílio. Nós estamos conseguindo, com esses encontros virtuais, a participação e engajamento de um número maior de pessoas. E eu parabenizo, agradeço a presença de cada um desses docentes, que através do Zoom e através dos canais virtuais estão nos acompanhando. Eu, como reitor, que eu posso falar? Eu dar aquela mensagem, não digo mensagem de otimismo, mas uma mensagem realista. Principalmente os docentes que entraram nos últimos 10 anos, encontraram a instituição inicialmente com um problema financeiro muito sério, e, mais recentemente, a pandemia que nos aplicou uma lei complementar que proíbe uma série de ações de gestão. É muito difícil fazer a gestão de uma instituição sem poder mexer no salário, sem poder premiar, sem poder garantir a carreira. Felizmente, a Universidade de São Paulo conseguiu uma escapatória legal comparado com as nossas co-irmãs, porque o nosso regimento, nosso estatuto é muito longo, mas talvez esse detalhamento permitiu que os nossos procuradores conseguissem meios de garantir os concursos de livre docência e a progressão da carreira para quem fizer o concurso e a progressão horizontal agora para os nossos docentes também. Isso não vai resolver o problema, mas vai aliviar um pouquinho. O que eu queria dizer, eu falei, acho que na primeira reunião, se não me engano, é que os docentes têm uma carreira que eu considero privilegiada. Eu estou nessa carreira há 45 anos. 46, já completou 46 anos. É uma coisa longa e eu nunca me arrependi de ter seguido essa carreira. E vivi, além da nossa crise dos últimos 10 anos, vivi outras crises da segunda metade da década de 80, a crise do começo da década de 90 e assim por diante. Eu não estou arrependido, eu quero transmitir a minha experiência para vocês, que é uma carreira muito interessante. É uma carreira que depende de nós. É uma carreira que nós damos nós definimos as linhas que nós queremos seguir e definimos a velocidade. E isto é fundamental. Mesmo com a situação da instituição não estar das melhores, mesmo tendo agora uma lei que nos restringe muitas coisas, continuamos tendo essa liberdade. Isto é muito importante, isto é muito definidor. Tem alguns autores que chamam, inclusive, a nossa carreira de carreira inteligente. Uma carreira que o termo não me parece tão adequado em português, mas em inglês dá uma ideia de uma carreira em que a pessoa, com a sua capacidade, com a sua decisão, com a sua definição, consegue alterar. E o que eu posso dizer para esses docentes, principalmente para os mais jovens, meus caros, minhas caras colegas, a crise institucional, a crise sanitária do país, a crise institucional do nosso país não tem que ser um obstáculo intransponível para nós. Como docentes, como pesquisadores, nós temos sim condições de, mesmo na turbulência, manter uma carreira inteligente, uma carreira dinâmica. E como docentes, nós temos, além da nossa remuneração, nós temos o reconhecimento dos nossos alunos, dos nossos pares. O prestígio que a gente conquista com essa dedicação, com a dedicação que nós damos aos nossos alunos e à nossa pesquisa. Então, temos sim uma carreira muito interessante, uma carreira muito marcante. Eu peço a todos, nunca desanimem, por pior que esteja a situação de contorno. Vocês têm competência, já mostraram por terem sido aprovados em concursos muito competitivos, têm competência para transformar a carreira de vocês numa carreira vitoriosa. E espero que aqueles que estão ainda no começo da carreira ou no meio da carreira, daqui a 20 anos, fiquem orgulhosos do trabalho que fizeram, fiquem orgulhosos de que superaram muitos obstáculos e contribuíram para a sociedade. Bom proveito no evento, aproveitem as mesas redondas, as discussões, aproveite o palestrante convidado, Michael Sandel, vai ser proveitoso com certeza. E eu espero, Marcílio, que o ano que vem a gente possa fazer isso de novo presencial, e eu aí já estarei como docente, então tenho o direito de participar tranquilamente, sem obrigação de fazer a abertura. Um abraço.
Será bem-vindo, tá? Obrigado, professor Varran, obrigado. Nós estamos aí com mais de 200 pessoas no YouTube e mais umas 50 aqui, estamos quase chegando a 300 presenciais aqui hoje, então já vi que a professora Elizabeth está aqui, já agradeci a ela anteriormente, e aí estamos esperando agora a entrada do professor Sandel e para ele começar a palestra. Então, vamos esperar, aguardar um pouquinho.
Então, anunciamos o encerramento dessa sessão de abertura, e como disse o professor Marcílio, na sequência teremos a palestra do professor Michael Sandel, professor de Harvard, e que fará a palestra de abertura com debate sobre o tema de seu livro, A Tirania do Mérito. O que aconteceu com o bem comum? Passamos agora, então, a partir de agora, a condução dos trabalhos para os professores Amâncio Jorge Oliveira e Elizabeth Balbachevski, que são os moderadores. A Universidade de São Paulo agradece aqui a presença e a audiência nos canais virtuais e deseja um ótimo evento.
Muito obrigado, Silvia. Professor Varran, muitíssimo obrigado pela abertura e pelo apoio de sempre. Sei que o senhor está com compromissos aí, fique à vontade, a gente vai conduzir os trabalhos aqui. Muito obrigado, viu? Marcílio, eu pediria para que, se fosse possível, você fazer uma introdução do professor Sandel, né, para que a professora Elizabeth já está presente, enquanto a gente aguarda o ingresso dele. Você tem uma apresentação dele, né, Marcílio?
Eu não tenho nada assim especial preparado sobre o currículo dele, mas assim eu sou uma das pessoas que leu o livro dele, né? Me interessei muito pelo tema e porque é um tema assim que me traz assim esses aspectos de justiça junto com ele, né? Porque o mérito a gente tem sempre assim uma noção de que ele é o sistema mais justo possível dentro da sociedade. E quando eu vi o professor Sandel questionando esse conceito, eu achei que seria um ponto assim muito importante de ser trazido aqui nesse encontro aí na universidade. E também na congregação que eu participo, no Conselho de Departamento e no CO, né, se fala muito a todo instante de meritocracia. O próprio sistema de avaliação, vocês lembram que o ano retrasado, nós tratamos de avaliação, o próprio conceito de avaliação está sempre sendo invocado, o mérito, né? E eu tenho cá as minhas ideias sobre esse conceito e como ser aplicado na carreira universitária, e é isso que a gente está querendo escutar do professor Sandel, né? Talvez uma pergunta de fundo, de base, seria essa: como usar um conceito mais justo para a progressão na carreira, que não seja só baseado nesse mérito externo, né? E circunstancial, né? Da qual a gente é submetido, circunstancial no sentido de que depende da minha herança, tanto genética quanto as minhas origens, mais justo para a progressão na carreira, né? Então tem vários aspectos só baseados que compõem isso e que essa é a minha grande curiosidade, então vou estar atento a isso. Então é isso, o Amâncio.
Tá. Acho que a gente poderia... Bruno, por favor.
Se ele não entrou ainda, eu queria só acrescentar uma coisa que para nós aqui da cultura latino-americana e da cultura das línguas neolatinas ou latinas. O professor Sandel foi agraciado em 2018 com o prêmio Princesa de Astúrias, que é um dos principais prêmios do mundo pelo seu trabalho em ciências sociais, e que incluiu toda a obra dele, que é traduzida para mais de 27 línguas, e dos quais talvez o mais popular e um dos mais conhecidos é essa publicação que existe aqui no Brasil, inclusive, já, A Tirania do Mérito. Eu só queria acrescentar isso da biografia dele.
Temos que esperar um pouquinho. Nós acertamos tudo com o professor Sandel, ele entraria 13h55. Temos que aguardar um pouquinho. Acabei de mandar já uma mensagem para ele. Então, vamos dar esses minutos aí. Não sei se, inclusive, a professora Elizabeth já andou trabalhando um pouquinho no conceito para se preparar para esse debate. Não sei se ela também gostaria de, talvez até se apresentar também e falar um pouquinho sobre isso. Fique à vontade, professor.
Sim, obrigada, Marcílio, obrigada pela oportunidade. Eu acho que essa discussão é uma discussão absolutamente atual em toda a literatura de sintometria. Nós temos algumas manifestações importantes, como o pronunciamento de São Francisco, que é uma discussão muito importante sobre os limites do impacto dessas medidas, tais como impacto de uma revista, etc., no desenho da estrutura de recompensas que o mundo acadêmico produz, e como esse tipo se aferrar demais a esse tipo de medida quantitativa pode causar profundos impactos negativos na vida, né, no pulsar da vida acadêmica. Mais recentemente, eu queria chamar a atenção dos nossos colegas algumas iniciativas muito interessantes vindas da Holanda, no sentido de criar estratégias múltiplas, né, para se avaliar o trabalho dos acadêmicos, né? Existe uma discussão extremamente interessante vinda da Universidade de Leiden. Não por acaso ela é uma das proponentes. Pronto, o professor Michael entrou na sala. Acho que podemos passar a palavra para ele.
Elizabeth, eu quero ouvir a sua conclusão sobre isso. Eu estava prestando atenção. Se você puder depois comentar e finalizar, eu agradeço.
Professor Michael Sandel, thank you very much for being with us on this meeting of lectures from the University of São Paulo. I am Marcílio. We have been in contact over email a few times, and we all do appreciate your time and willing to talk about meritocracy. Some of your audience today did read your book. For instance, in my case, that's my case. Mm-hmm. And we also followed you in some channels here. And then we have one of the organizers, Professor Amancio, who is going to be by you all the time and checking the questions and so on. And Professor Elizabeth Balbachevsky, who was just a few minutes ago talking about meritocracy for us while we waited for you. And then we thank you again, and we leave the floor for you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's Marcílio and colleagues. It's really an honor to be able to join you for this, I hope, discussion and dialogue about meritocracy. My book is The Tyranny of Merit, which may seem like a paradox, because normally we think of merit as a good thing. If I need surgery performed, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. Merit is a good thing. So how can merit become a tyranny? That's the question I would like to really present for discussion. And let me explain why, and then we'll see what people say. Now, meritocracy is more than just merit. Meritocracy is a system of rule, and it's a way of conceiving deservingness. Who deserves what? At the heart of the meritocratic idea is the principle that if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. They've earned it. That's the meritocratic idea. It's inspiring in some ways. It stands opposed to traditional hierarchies of birth. It also stands opposed to allocating jobs and social roles based on nepotism, cronyism, favoritism, and corruption. So all of these features of the meritocracy make it seem attractive as an ideal for a just society, for a good society. So what could be wrong with it? My argument is that meritocracy has a dark side, and the dark side is connected to the attitudes toward success that it generates. If we look over the last few decades, the era of globalization, we see that the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, driving us apart. This widening gap has partly to do with widening inequality of income and wealth. But it's not only that. It has also to do, it seems to me, with changing attitudes toward success that have accompanied the widening inequality. Those who have landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, something they deserve. And by implication, that those who struggle, those who fall short, must deserve their fate as well. This is the dark side of meritocracy, these attitudes. I call it the meritocratic hubris of elites, of the successful, by which I mean the tendency of the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget a sense of indebtedness to those who made their achievements possible, indebtedness to family and teachers, neighborhood and community, country, the times in which we live. Now, my main argument, reason for writing the book, is to make sense of the anger and resentment that we see in many of our societies against elites, especially professional elites, credentialed elites, educational elites. Great resentment on the part of many working people especially, who feel the sense that elites look down on them. And this is connected to the meritocratic hubris I was describing. Unless we find a way to address the dark side of meritocracy, to address inequalities directly, inequalities of income and wealth and power directly, I don't think that we are going to be able to respond to the resentment that fuels the politics of grievance that has led us, both of our countries, in the direction of rather dangerous developments for democracy. And so it's this concern, this worry about the shadow that now hangs over democratic societies that led me to want to try to make sense of what, beyond the fact of economic inequality, why is it that the hubris of elites has generated such a backlash, such resentment from large numbers of people in our societies who don't trust elites, who don't believe that elites care about the common good, and who, sadly, in much of their complaints, have a point. So that's really just an introduction to the main argument of my book, The Tyranny of Merit. But I really welcome the opportunity to develop the argument further, to respond to possible objections, and to see what colleagues think.
Thank you, Professor, very much. Amancio Oliveira is speaking. I'd like to know, first of all, the case of USP. USP is an elite creation, and thinking in a good, common good. So it's a different experience, you say. But anyway, let me start. Thank for this such inspiring lecture. Professor Elizabeth Balbashevitz, Professor of Political Science Department and Head of Research Commission of Institute of Advanced Studies, will address some short comments or questions. I'm going to take advantage of my condition of coordinator of this panel and address two questions to you, Professor Sanders. The first is the idea of your book. It seems that mobility as answer of inequality is the best way, or at least a good option, of promotion equality of opportunity. I understand that structures changing is the best way, but sometimes it's not feasible. So I would like to understand better this contradiction between mobility as answer of inequality. And the second question, important for this event, is how it's possible to have a university competition or career without invoking the traditional concept of meritocracy. So I pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Elizabeth Balbashevitz, that you make some comments. Thank you, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amancio. Thank you very much, Professor Sandel. I think that you point a very important issue for our societies. I think you are right. This is a quite important divide inside our societies, because I think that as well as the American society, Brazilian society has a deeply ingrained idea of meritocracy. Let's say, for instance, that we all look at the public universities in our society as merit universities. We look at our students and say they merit support from the government because they passed in a selective exam in order to have access to the public universities. And then we look at, let's say, the students from the private university, private institutions in Brazil. And it's not very unusual for us to look at them and say, no, they don't deserve any kind of support from the government because they didn't pass in our exams. They are not as worth students as the students from the public sector. I would like for us to think about this, because I think that this ingrained idea of meritocracy, it's very important, shaping the design of, let's say, the policies for higher education in Brazil. And when we look at our university, Professor Amancio is right, is, let's say, the top of the hierarchies, institutional hierarchies inside Brazil, and I would say inside Latin America as well. It's a very well respectable university. and then we look at us and say, well, we need, and Professor Amancio mentioned that, we need to have some kind of measures of our worthiness in order to be promoted in our career. We need to have some ideas about what the career should promote, what the career should recognize. But at the University of São Paulo, like many other big universities, are, let's say, a multiversity, in the sense that it's called to answer many different demands from the society. It's called to answer the demands for having an important role in our innovation systems. We are called to have important roles in training the new generations. We have important roles in creating mechanisms of inclusiveness for our in our society, bring students from poor backgrounds to our, this is very important for us. But this means also for our academics that we have many different roles to perform. And not always these roles are compatible, or let's say your qualities to perform one role does not mean that you also have the qualities to perform another role. Let's say a good teacher is not always a good researcher. A good researcher is not always a good teacher. So I think that this, I would like you to discuss a bit more how it's possible for us to organize different career paths inside our university that could recognize this diversity of competencies, qualities, skills, and alternative of professional paths that it's possible inside the university, and it's needed in order the university to perform the multiple tasks that a multiversity is supposed to have in our society. Because otherwise, I think, yes, you are almost completely right. The upper of meritocracy is creating, it's deepening the divide of the losers, between the losers and the winners, created by globalization in our societies. And this creates, it's a room for neopopulism and resentment and things like that. Thank you very much, Professor.
The floor is yours, Professor.
Well, thank you both for those really important and challenging questions. And let me see if I can respond. The response may not be satisfactory, but at least it may provoke further discussion. First, I'm aware, just as Professor Balbashevsky has pointed out, that in Brazil, the public universities are the most competitive, the most selective, the most distinguished for the most part. And I think that's a great achievement. I wish that that were true in more countries where the publicly funded universities really were at the apex in achieving excellence. That is so important, and that is an important achievement that should not be lost. That needs to be protected and prized. Now, I'll come in a moment to the question of the multiversity and the multiple roles and the challenges that poses. But first, I'd like to go back to Professor Oliveira's question about whether mobility is a sufficient answer to inequality. One of the central arguments of my book is that in recent decades, as inequality has widened, the response by mainstream parties and politicians and political leaders to the inequality has not been to deal with the inequality directly through structural change, but instead to offer individual upward mobility through higher education. And here I'll speak about the politicians in my own country, Democrats and Republicans alike. For the past 4 decades, they've said, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to university. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. Now, this seems inspiring, this message of striving through individual upward mobility. But there is implicit in that message an insult. And the insult is this: if you're struggling in the new economy, and if you've not been to university, your failure is your fault. That's the implication. And the politicians who have offered this slogan about you too can rise if only you improve yourself, first of all, that deflects attention and focus from the structural conditions of the economy that gave rise to these inequalities. It lets the politicians and the political parties who presided over neoliberal globalization off the hook. Instead of critically reflecting on the policies that created the inequalities, they tell the victims of those policies, your education is deficient, that's why you're suffering. And if only you will get a university degree, then you too will be able to escape from this inequality, from this wage stagnation, from this loss of jobs. That's the implicit insult in what seems like a bright, shining, inspiring offer of upward mobility. It's especially politically damaging, this implicit insult, because most people don't have a university degree. In the United States, we're a relatively well-educated society, but nearly 2/3 of Americans do not have a 4-year college degree. And the same is true in most European countries and most Latin American countries. So it's folly, I think, to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition for decent work and a dignified life a university degree that most people don't have. That's why I think that's one reason, Professor Oligera, that I don't believe that mobility is a satisfactory response to inequality. Here's a second. Our societies are not very mobile. It is not easy to rise. In Northern Europe, they do a pretty good job of enabling people to rise, people born into a poor family, low-income family, to rise in a generation. In Denmark, for example, the number of generations it takes for someone from low-income families to reach the average income, I don't mean wealthy, average, is 2 generations in Denmark. In the United States, it takes 5 generations. In Brazil, what do you suppose the figure is? 9 generations on average for someone from a low-income family to reach the average income. So here's why I don't think, now, I'm not against mobility. It's wonderful if people from poor backgrounds are recruited to USP and flourish and rise. That's something to celebrate. But we shouldn't confuse our celebration of those young people who were able to achieve this. We shouldn't confuse that celebration with a solution to inequality, because it doesn't address the fundamental structural problems with the economy, and it doesn't address the needs of most people. And it reinforces the meritocratic hubris, because if the politicians can say, If the elites can say, well, look, here's an example of someone who did it. Why don't you do it? Why doesn't your child do it? And we've heard this. So the celebration even has a kind of dark side if it's used as a way of justifying or being complacent in the face of these structural inequalities. That's my worry, Professor Oliveira. Now, now let me move to the questions that were put by both colleagues about the role of meritocracy in university admissions, and for that matter, the role of universities. Professor Balbashevsky mentioned the multiple roles that universities and higher education play in our societies. One of those roles is to serve as sorting machines for market-driven meritocratic societies. There are many other roles, but my worry is that as the meritocratic pressures have intensified, especially on young people, and as the premium, the advantage in hiring, in income, lifelong earnings for college graduates has increased, the sorting machine function of universities has grown in significance and importance and emphasis and focus. And this, I think, is beginning to crowd out our educational mission. Cultivating the love of teaching and learning, that's made more difficult when students and their parents, and therefore the universities, become increasingly focused on their credentializing function rather than on our educational mission. So that's a general worry. As far as meritocratic admissions, admitting students based on merit, well, it depends on how that merit is measured. It's measured partly by standardized entrance exams, sometimes by grades in high school and other measures. The entrance exams that are typically used, and I'm not as familiar as I should be with the Brazilian entrance examination system, but in most countries that rely heavily on entrance exams to measure merit, most countries find that there is a very close correlation between family income and the likelihood of getting a high score on the entrance exam. And this is without cheating, this is without favoritism, this is without giving an advantage to donors to the university. This is strictly looking at the meritocratic mode of selection. And insofar as that's true, and you'll tell me to what extent that maybe that's not so much the case in Brazil, but insofar as that's true, then what seems like a meritocratic principle of selection actually reproduces the class advantages rather than overcomes them and surmounts them. I'll give you one example from my own experience. In the United States, if you look at the Ivy League and elite universities, at their class profile, there are more students at these places from the top 1% of families, the richest 1%, than there are from families in the bottom half of the income scale put together, more from the top 1% than from the bottom 50%. So, and this is largely because of the way affluent families are able to pass along their advantages through education. It used to be that they would pass along their advantages by bequeathing land holdings or estates or trust funds. Now it's passing along the ability to score well on entrance exams. And so I think we need to consider that even the fairest administration of entrance exams, first, may not be a true measure of merit, and second, may reproduce the very class privileges that meritocracy as a principle claimed to provide an alternative to. But the two of you should be able to respond. What would you say?
Thank you, Professor. We have two more questions. I think João Cortese and Tito Lotufo, and then Professor Bruno Caramelli. So you can open the micro and make the questions, please.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us, Dr. Sandel. I'm just wondering if another problem related with the notion of merit isn't also that it carries an idea of value along with it.
Yeah.
So a successful athlete or businessman will be more valuable than any other person, like any other person in any other function in the society. So the idea of merit it's sort of corrupting our own human value and our own humanity in that sense. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a danger. I think it's a danger because the role that merit plays in a meritocracy, which strictly speaking means rule by those with merit, with talent, it does imply judgments of value. I agree very much with Tito Lotufo. And that's because a meritocracy is not all, it says two things, not one thing. It says those who are the best qualified for a job or a role should be the ones to receive it. That by itself is fine. But it also makes a judgment that they deserve it, that the meritorious deserve all of the advantages that attach to being qualified for this or that job or social role. And that's exactly what leads to judgments about value, valuing some more highly than others. And it's made even worse, this judgment of value, when we assume, as we so easily assume, that the money people make is the measure of their merit. Now, on reflection, we know that's not true. We know that the market is not a good judge of merit, much less value. If it were, then we would have to conclude that a hedge fund manager or a high-speed trader on Wall Street is more valuable than a teacher or a nurse. 800 times more valuable, 900 times more valuable. But even the most ardent defenders of laissez-faire markets would be hard-pressed to take that position. So yes, there are judgments of value that quickly follow upon assignments of merit in meritocratic societies like ours. Thank you for that.
Bruno, please.
Yes, thank you, Amancio. Thanks, Professor Sandel. I would like to ask you, I came across to some information after the Floyd's assassination in the US that was a claim to elite universities, especially Stanford, to open 20% quotas for racial students in order to try to change a little bit this disadvantage. This problem is more recently addressed, trying to be more addressed recently in Brazil. I would like to know from you, what are your thoughts, if you can share with us, if this racial quota or economical or social quotas can change or decrease this social and racial disadvantage? What do you think about the quotas addressing the merit, the problems created by meritocracy? Can you share your opinions with us, please?
Yes, thank you, Bruno. First, I should say that US universities have taken race and ethnicity into account long before the George Floyd murders. Since the 1970s, many universities have taken race into account and ethnicity in admissions. And this has been a point of controversy and debate for decades in the United States, and it's gone to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in the 1970s that universities may consider race and ethnicity provided they don't use a fixed numerical quota, but take it into account as part of a consideration looking at the students as a whole. I think that understood in this way, it's an entirely legitimate and desirable addition to admissions policies. So I'm in favor of affirmative action. However, affirmative action has been quite successful in many US universities, public and private, in increasing opportunities for students from racial and ethnic minorities. And that's been a very important achievement. But there has been less focus and less success on admitting students from low-income families, which of course does not necessarily coincide. And so I think we need to do more, and perhaps USP has already, it was mentioned earlier, been taking into consideration the class background of the applicants. Because if we're really to fulfill the civic mission of the university, and this goes back to the multiple missions that Professor Balbashevsky mentioned, one of our missions is to cultivate citizens to lead democratic societies. And if we find that all of our students are from affluent families and very few from low-income families or from underrepresented racial and ethnic and cultural groups, then we're not doing a very good job of fulfilling our civic mission or even providing the kind of education for our students that exposes them to students from different walks of life. So I think we need to do more to emphasize access to those from low-income families and students from so-called first-generation families, students whose parents did not attend university. So I would extend it that way. But I want to add one other qualification, Bruno, to your question. Even if we succeed in doing this, and I'm in favor of it, it is not a sufficient response to the injustices associated with structural economic inequality, nor is it an adequate response to racial injustice, which persists. You mentioned the murder of George Floyd. To address that racial injustice, affirmative action programs, however successful, don't begin to address the pervasive problem of police violence against unarmed Black men, which we've had, sadly, time and again, doesn't begin to address the racial injustice associated with very high incarceration rates. Here I'm speaking about the United States. You will know more about the Brazilian situation than I do. very high incarceration rates. This has not to do with meritocracy. Meritocracy is not the solution to the injustice of police violence and of the very high incarceration rate, especially among young Black men. So this is another example of how a single-minded focus either on meritocracy, making the meritocracy more perfect, or encouraging individual upward mobility through college education, desirable though those things are, I think they can distract us and they can lead us to a kind of complacence with regard to these other sources of inequality and injustice. Bruno.
João Cortez, please.
Thank you, Professor Amancio. Thank you, Professor Sandel, for your talk. I would like to ask, in which measure do you think that the actual meritocracy problem comes from a technocratic society based on a kind of a scientificism, that is, thinking that everything can be solved by science? In a broader sense, do you think that the presence of modern science in society has influenced such a situation? I think about the problem of dealing with every domain of society by an instrumental reason, as criticized by Charles Taylor, as well as the vision that human beings are only moved by incentives and not by inner motivations, as some economic models do propose. Thank you.
Yes, Jean, thank you so much for that question. I have a short answer. Yes, I agree with you. Technocracy and scientism and instrumental reason are connected to the problem I'm trying to diagnose, closely connected. Because part of the way we conceive of meritocratic elites is by defining merit in technocratic terms. Now, we could go all the way. I should ask you, Jean, are you an economist or what is your background? Your field. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I come from epistemology and ethics. I'm a philosophy teacher.
All right. So you thought that through. Now, so I think what's happened to corrupt the meritocracy that we have and that we practice is a technocratic definition of merit. And the technocratic definition of merit comes, I would not say from science generally. I would distinguish between science and scientism, which you mentioned. Scientism is the conceit, the hubris, that science can deliver answers to social and economic and political questions. That's scientism. And it's important to distinguish scientism, which is an ideology, or you might say an epistemology, from science. And we see this if we look, I've been speaking about the way neoliberal globalization has been enacted over the past 4 decades. Among the most influential advocates of the neoliberal version of globalization that has created the inequalities have been certain orthodox economists. You can see, Jean, why I asked you whether you were an economist. And it's interesting, during the debate in Brexit, you remember in 2016, before Trump was elected, Britain voted for Brexit. Elites were shocked. Why did this happen? How could people vote for leaving the European Union when that will, according to economic experts, diminish GDP? During the Brexit debate, one of the proponents of Brexit was offered this argument, and he had a memorable reply. He said, I think this country has had quite enough of experts. The vote for Brexit and the vote for Trump was in large part a backlash against elites, and in particular, technocratic elites. And the target was not entirely misdirected because technocratic elites, including economists and the politicians who followed their advice, actually had a pretty poor record of governance over the last 4 decades. They brought about an economy that did grow, but where almost all of the growth due to globalization went to the top 10 or 20%. The bottom 60% had stagnant wages or lower wages in real terms. The technocratic elite, and here I'm speaking perhaps from a US point of view, brought us the financial crisis of 2008. The technocratic elite, informed by those same economists and Wall Street experts, brought us a bailout, a taxpayer bailout of Wall Street firms after the financial crash that helped the Wall Street banks, but left ordinary homeowners to fend for themselves, and that created a recession from which the banks rebounded quickly, but from which the real economy did not recover from for quite a long time. These were the policies brought about by meritocratic elites, technocratic elites. Now, the difference between merit in governance, this goes back to the first distinction between merit and meritocracy. Merit in governing is not only having command of economic efficiency and economic models. It's not only technocratic knowledge. Merit in governing requires judgment. Aristotle called it phronesis, practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is a quality of judgment that isn't conveyed by technocratic or economistic training. It involves a judgment, value-laden judgment about the common good. It requires the ability to identify with one's fellow citizens from all walks of life, to understand their aspirations and their troubles, and to fashion from that sympathetic understanding a conception of the common good and practical ways of trying to seek the common good. That's merit in governing. That's not meritocracy. It's not technocratic expertise. It's judgment, it's phronesis, it's practical wisdom. And we've lost sight of that. So a large part of my critique of where meritocracy goes wrong coincides with the critique of technocratic conceptions of merit and of expertise, which have neglected, so it seems to me, considerations of the common good.
Professor Sanders, I will give some opportunities to our colleagues from YouTube. They want to make some questions. First of all, Emanuela Aparecida Miranda wants to know about the quota policy, affirmative action. Is it good for the idea of meritocracy? How do you see that? Aniki Sethi is asking if it's possible to see meritocracy in a collective social practice instead of individual one. Hudson Carvalho is asking about the idea of luck and preparedness. Luck without preparedness means nothing. So, what is the role of luck in the career? And the last one is José Augusto Carvalho Filho is saying that the best university of the US is private one. So should we copy this model, or it's not a good idea? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for those questions. To Emmanuel's question about affirmative action, this goes back to our earlier discussion. I'm in favor of affirmative action for racial and ethnic diversity, but also for diversity with regard to class background. I don't think this necessarily contradicts meritocracy. I think it broadens the conception of merit. As for whether, Anika's question, whether meritocracy can be a collective social practice rather than an individual kind of striving, well, it depends what one means by merit. If merit means deliberating as democratic citizens together from all walks of life about the problems we face and about how to identify the common good, then yes, then that is the kind of society that can aspire to a kind of a collective social practice seeking merit. The ancient philosophers called it civic virtue and the common good. But that's very different from an individualistic conception of rising as the sole answer to inequality. And it's different from trying to test and measure each individual person's merit through standardized tests. As for the role of luck in career, luck in life, actually, the question of luck is very interesting. A belief in merit, a belief that society is organized in a way such that the successful deserve their success and their rewards, misses the important role of luck in life. It leads those who succeed to forget the role of luck, the luck in what parents I happen to be born to, the luck in what society I happen to be born into, and with what talents. We can see this if we, and so the remembering luck is an important counter-argument to notions of moral deservingness that we easily accept. Take a great sports star, Neymar, for example. He was blessed with great talents as a football player, as an athlete. Now, some will say, yes, but he works hard. He devotes effort to cultivating his talents, and that's true. But can it really be said that Neymar deserves, or any of us deserves, the full market rewards that flow to the exercise of our talents? There are two moral arguments to doubt that we do deserve the benefits that flow from the exercise of our talents. One of them is our talents are not our doing. They're our gifts. They are our good luck. Secondly, the fact that we live in a society that happens to honor and reward and prize and value the talents we happen to have, that too is our good luck. That's not our own doing. If Neymar had lived during the Renaissance, he might not have been as famous and as successful as he is today, because they didn't care as much back then about football. They cared more about fresco painters. And so there are two elements of luck or contingency in success. One is having certain talents in the first place. The other is living in a society at a time that happens to value the talents we've been lucky enough to be born with or to acquire. So for these two reasons, luck undermines inflated claims of being morally deserving of all the benefits that flow from my achievement. And finally, the United States, a great many of the best US universities are private, whereas the reverse is true in Brazil, where the public universities tend to be the most distinguished. And the question is, should Brazil try to emulate the United States in this respect? I would say no, not necessarily. I think it's a very good thing if private donors and foundations want to found private universities, especially if they have a social and civic mission and sense of responsibility, especially if those universities do not simply become places for the affluent rather than for the entire society. Founding new universities through the use of private resources, philanthropic resources, that's a good thing, and I would encourage it. But I think, and this goes back to the earlier part of the discussion, I think having truly outstanding public universities accessible to everyone who qualifies, supported by the public, that is of enormous importance to any society. And I think we could learn something, the US could learn something from Brazil. We had, and we still do have, some outstanding public universities. For example, the University of California, Berkeley. And there are a great many others, the University of Michigan, the University of Texas. But over time, public support for even these very distinguished public universities, the public support has diminished to become a small fraction of the budget. And these distinguished universities have to raise considerable amounts of private money, even though they are public universities. So this is a risk, this is a danger. And so I would prize and cherish the tradition Brazil has achieved of having outstanding public universities, which is not to say that there shouldn't be room for philanthropic-minded founders to create new universities, provided they are open and accessible and with a broad civic mission.
Professor, I'm going to make the last question, pass the floor to Gustavo, and then to Professor Elizabeth, and then back to you. Professor Michael did the next question. How do you feel the apparent trade-off between paternalistic posture and autonomous decision-maker from collectiveness?
Paternalistic what?
Posture, behavior, paternalistic behavior, compared to autonomous decision-maker from collectiveness.
Well, this is a very broad question.
Let me pass to Gustavo, and then Elizabeth, and then you make the final.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go
Gustavo,
ahead,
please. Professor Gustavo, please.
Yeah.
Hey, hi everyone. Congratulations to all organizers for this brilliant event, and special thanks to Professor Sandel for sharing his experience and insights and thoughts. My question was partially answered, Professor, when you mentioned the difference between individual merit and civil virtue. Because to me, what I would like you to comment on is the concepts of judgment and prejudice. Are those negative feelings, actions inherent to meritocracy, or this is a result of our poor education, poor moral, and poor ethics in our society?
Professor Elizabeth, please.
Professor, thank you for your words. I think that you make a really a differential point in our understanding of the role of universities, especially these public, highly prestigious universities we have in Brazil. I think that, I think it's very important for us that live in Brazil, that we should recognize that we live in a deeply hierarchical society. We have an education system that it's entirely organized for allowing access to the university, despite the fact that we live outside in this tract. Almost 2/3 of our students, our youth in these tracts. We have a highly hierarchical university system. We differentiate universities if they are public or private, and which is okay. But the problem is that by doing that, we also differentiate the worthiness of our students in terms of the public policies they deserve to have. And the other thing that it's quite important, I think that is something that we should discuss among us, is that we look at the other institutions in our higher education with a degree of contempt, in the sense that, for instance, we look at our vocational system, our technological programs, as less relevant kind of degree, something that it's not worth of the university to give. We have, for instance, here at the state of São Paulo, a wide system of technological colleges. And our universities, our public universities, are quite resistant in interact with this college system and create a more flexible designs of degrees, of qualifications. We have a strong resistance to recognize credits our students earn in other schools, in other universities. So I think that we have you raise a lot of questions that it would be very important for us to think about, to address, and maybe to make a self-critics of how we behave, how we as university, especially as a public university, behave in relationship with our peers, institutional peers in the higher education, Brazilian higher education system. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
The floor is yours, Professor.
All right. Now, I don't want to keep people too long, but do we have a few extra minutes, or do we need to end immediately?
No, absolutely. You have more time. Yeah,
okay. First, on the question of paternalism versus individual autonomy. That's a very broad question of political theory that's been debated for a very long time. And I do have views about it, but I think that we have to resolve questions of paternalism versus individual autonomy case by case and debate the actual cases where this dilemma arises. As for Gustavo, so that's Professor Michael's question. For Gustavo, are judgment and prejudice inherent to meritocracy? And by judgment, I assume you mean the tendency of elites to look down. I think that looking down on those less fortunate or less successful than oneself is an all too common human tendency. It's not unique to meritocratic societies, but meritocracy encourages this unfortunate tendency because it teaches us that where one ends up in the social and economic ladder is something that is earned, that is deserved. The successful deserve their success. It's through their effort and hard work that they achieved it. So looking down on the less fortunate may not be inherent to meritocracy, but it is a built-in tendency because of this idea of earning our own place in the world. Finally, Professor Elizabeth raises really important questions about the responsibility that those of us in higher education and in elite institutions of higher education, the responsibility we have for the 2/3 of young people who don't go, who don't get a degree from higher education. I think that it's important, as Professor Elizabeth mentioned, to remember vocational and technical training. We have created in our societies a steep hierarchy, not only of income, but a hierarchy of prestige. And this is felt powerfully within higher education. And I think we should reconsider that steep hierarchy of prestige. I think that those of us in higher education should, of course, we should do our very best for our students. But we should remind ourselves and we should remind our students that we share responsibility, especially those of us who enjoy the benefits of higher education. We have a responsibility as citizens to share and make accessible whatever advantages we may enjoy to the wider society. I'm sometimes asked by critics of my book, well, if I don't think meritocracy, even a perfect meritocracy, is enough, what am I for? Am I saying that there has to be a perfect equality of result where everyone has the same income and the same wealth? That's not the only alternative. The alternative that matters in a democratic society is to have a broad democratic equality of condition, by which I mean to create an economy and create a society where all citizens, whatever, whether or not they have a college degree, can hold their heads up high, can be recognized for the contributions they make through their work, whether it's as a professional or whether it's as a street cleaner. And an important part of this broad democratic equality of condition has to do with the broad diffusion of education, especially civic education. And here I'm not talking only about technical training. I think all members of the society should be exposed to civic learning, exposed to moral and political philosophy in a way that relates to their lives. We've made the mistake of making higher education and universities the repository of teaching about civic education and moral and political philosophy, and then we conduct a tournament to see who can enter the citadel. I think that we should find ways to create a broad diffusion of learning opportunities throughout the society, in community colleges, community settings, in workplace settings. One of the early labor movements in the United States in the late 19th century, they were called the Knights of Labor. Among their demands, in addition to better wages and better working conditions, among their demands was reading rooms in factories so that working people could, on their breaks, inform themselves, read newspapers, read magazines and books to inform themselves about public affairs so that they, as workers, could equip themselves to be democratic citizens. This is what I mean by the broad diffusion of democratic knowledge. In a very small way, I did an experiment in this when we filmed my Harvard course on justice. Before the existence of MOOCs and online learning, and we made it available online, free for anyone, anywhere who was interested. We never imagined, I certainly never imagined, that millions of people around the world would want to watch lectures on philosophy. But it was an experiment to see whether we could prove that higher education can be a public good, not just a private privilege. One other example, and it's a personal experience. During a visit to Brazil several years ago, I was in Rio. And before the event I was, the day before, I went to a favela. And I met and sat with some young people in the favela and had a discussion with them about philosophical questions, including questions of justice and injustice, violence. They were struggling with violence in their communities, police violence, equality and inequality, what it means to be a citizen. One of my guides who helped lead this discussion was a man named Reginaldo. And he grew up in that favela. I think he was now about 50. And he didn't know how to read until he was 25. And I asked him how he learned how to read. And he said he made his living as a trash picker. He would go to garbage cans and pick out trash, valuable things. And one day, when he was picking trash in a well-off neighborhood in Rio, he found a torn portion of a book. And he was turning the pages of the book, and the owner of the house came out and asked what he was doing. And he said he was trying to read it. The owner of the house was a retired professor from the university in Rio. And he taught Reginaldo how to read. And the book that he had found in the trash, the torn book, was about the trial of Socrates, Plato's Socratic dialogues. And so Reginaldo then, he got the full book and he read his way through Plato. And he joined me for this discussion about justice and injustice in the favela. This is a small example, but it stuck with me. It's a small example of the broad diffusion of civic learning and democratic knowledge that healthy democratic societies need. And so, with apologies for the long answer, this is the alternative, it seems to me, to a society of winners and losers. This is the alternative to a society where the successful believe their success is their own doing and look down on those who struggle. This is an alternative, to go back to Professor Elizabeth, this is an alternative to the steep hierarchy of prestige and esteem that we too easily, and I'm speaking myself included, we in higher education too easily accept. So what's at stake in my book, The Tyranny of Merit, ultimately really is the democratic project and how we can save and vindicate the democratic project from the anger and resentment that a society of winners and losers has brought about. I've learned a lot from this discussion and been stimulated by it, and I want to thank you all very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sandel. It was a big honor for having you at University of São Paulo today with so brilliant conference. Please, Professor Marcílio.
Yeah, I think, Professor Sandel, you may not follow us. What's coming next is going to be in Portuguese. Perhaps if you want to train a bit the Portuguese, you are welcome to stay on. But before you leave, if you leave, I would like to thank you again for your support to this meeting and for bringing new ideas And especially from what I noticed in the end of your talk today, I was very pleased to learn also that you brought to us an aspect of life that is much related to feelings rather than only intellectual things. And then I think this is much appreciated in a society that needs to get away a little bit from artificial intelligence and all these trends, new trends that are going on, and bring a bit the human being to the center of this discussion. So I do thank you again for all the support, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marsilio, and thanks to all of the colleagues here for welcoming me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, professor. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bom, pessoal, agora nós temos as salas. A primeira coisa a falar para o pessoal do YouTube é que, se eles quiserem participar das duas salas que vamos ter agora, uma sobre USP e sociedade e outra sobre estrutura de poder na USP, eles teriam que entrar no link do Zoom para poderem falar, né? Mas se eles quiserem só participar com questões e comentários no YouTube, também são bem-vindos. E uma sala, então, vai ficar coordenada pela Ana Estela e pelo professor José Krieger, e a outra sala vai ficar coordenada pelo professor Bruno Caramelli e o professor Renato Janine Ribeiro. Então, essa última que eu falei é sobre estrutura de poder, né? E a da Ana Estela, junto com o Krieger, sobre USP e sociedade. E aí nós vamos fazer isso até às 4 horas, agora são 3h15, há um papo gostoso, espero que tenham algumas conclusões, depois a gente se reúne às 4, todos juntos aqui, para conversar mais um pouquinho.
Marcílio,
então, aqui... Pois não, fala, Márcio.
Um adendo, essa sessão não será transmitida para o YouTube, então quem quiser nos acompanhar nos debates, o link está na descrição do YouTube, então poderá entrar aqui no Zoom e aí escolher uma das salas. O Marcelo, que é o nosso aqui coordenador técnico, vai explicar como é que faz essa escolha de uma das duas salas disponíveis para os debates.
Ok, boa tarde, professores. Aqui embaixo, se vocês aproximarem o mouse daqui da tela que vocês estão vendo, vocês vão ver uma barra do Zoom. Na extrema direita da sua barra, se não aparecer um quadradinho composto por 4 quadrados, que está escrito Breakout Rooms, ou salas simultâneas, nos 3 pontinhos que tem mais à direita ainda, ele vai aparecer. Clicando nesse botão, vocês podem escolher entre a sala 1, que é a estrutura de poder da USP, e a sala 2, que é a USP e a sociedade. Escolhendo a sala, se vocês não estiverem vendo, tem uma lista de nomes, vocês podem descer até o final onde aparecem as duas salas, tá? Podem ir rolando a lista que vocês vão ver lá no final. Vocês podem, ao lado do nome da sala, tem join, ou junte-se, ou não sei como é que tá, que língua que tá para vocês aí. Aí tá livre para vocês escolherem o que quiserem. Qualquer dúvida, quem não conseguir entrar numa sala, só me chama, só abrir um microfone, que eu vou liberar agora, um momentinho só. É só liberar, é só me chamar aqui que eu ajudo vocês a entrarem na sala que vocês quiserem.
Muito obrigada. A gente precisa sair dessa para poder entrar na outra, porque a minha não...
Obrigatoriamente, professora, quando escolher a outra sala, você já sai dessa sala principal.
Eu entrar lá, mas é engraçado que eu não estou conseguindo.
Então, já achou o botão aqui, Breakout Room?
Já achei. Eu estou clicando em cima do botão, só que...
Para qual sala que a senhora quer que eu já movo a senhora?
Preciso ir para 2.
Ok, um momentinho só.
Obrigada.
Sala 2, pronto, tá indo.
Obrigada.
Alguém mais com dificuldade aí que eu posso ajudar?
Marcelo, no chat tem uma pergunta da Lívia, achando que tem links separados. Talvez você possa ajudar com essa resposta.
Não são links separados, professor. Tem que realmente clicar no botão aqui embaixo do lado direito da barra, que é Breakout Rooms, e aí escolher qual sala que pretende. Insisto, se vocês tiverem dificuldade, só me dizer qual sala que vocês querem que eu...
Então, Marcelo,
se não aparece o botão Breakout Rooms, do lado direito tem 3 pontinhos, More. Se clicar nesses 3 pontinhos, provavelmente abrirá a opção de Breakout Rooms.
Para mim não está aparecendo nem o Breakout Rooms, nem os 3 pontinhos. Tá?
Professor, para qual sala o senhor quer ir?
Sala 1.
Ok, já mando o senhor para lá, por favor.
Obrigado.
Já foi.
Idem, Marcelo, é a Lívia de novo. Eu queria ir
Diga.
para 2, por favor.
Para qual sala, professora Lívia?
2, por gentileza.
Um momentinho só. Sala 2, pronto.
Obrigada.
Thaís, tudo bem?
Alguém mais com dificuldade aí que eu possa ajudá-los?
Eu também, eu sou a Dalgisa, eu estou querendo ir para a sala 2 e não estou conseguindo.
Um momentinho só, professora.
2.
Quem mais?
Não, eu quero a sala 1, então, perdão. O meu é sala... Não. A Dalgisa aqui, eu quero ir para a sala de... Perdão, eu quero ir para a sala da questão da... estrutura de poder na USP. Eu também, eu sou a Dalgisa, eu estou querendo ir para a sala 2 e não estou conseguindo.
Um momentinho só, professora.
2.
Alguém está assistindo pelo YouTube aí com o som ligado e está dando retorno.
Não, perdão, o meu é sala... Não. A Dalgisa aqui, eu quero ir para a sala de...
Se puder desligar o som do YouTube, quem estiver assistindo aí está dando retorno aqui.
A questão da... estrutura de poder na USP. Eu também, eu sou a Dalgisa, eu estou querendo ir para a sala 2 e não estou conseguindo. Um momentinho só, professor.
Alguém mais com problema de ir para alguma sala?
Eu não estou conseguindo.
Quem está falando?
É a Luciana.
Qual sala você quer ir?
Eu queria ir para a sala 2.
Sala 2.
Obrigada.
Quem mais?
Eu voltei aqui a Dalgisa, agora acho que eu desliguei. Eu não perdão, mas eu não estou conseguindo ir para lugar nenhum.
Então, eu te
quero
mandei
a sala 1.
Tá. É que agora eu te... A Dalgisa, sala 1. Um momentinho só. Pronto, para a sala 1.
Muito obrigada.
Nada, imagina, que isso. Alguém mais precisa de ajuda?
Por
Marcelo,
favor,
eu entrei
eu gostaria de ir para a sala 1.
Agora acho que eu desliguei. Eu não perdão, mas eu não estou conseguindo ir para lugar nenhum.
Professora Márcia, a senhora está assistindo pelo YouTube também, está dando retorno por aqui.
Ah, tá bom.
É que agora eu te...
Tá, eu estou assistindo pelos 2, então eu vou
É só mutar o do YouTube, porque dá retorno pelo seu microfone aqui, fica como se fosse um eco.
Tá
Marcelo, você consegue me mandar para a sala 2? Luciana Venturini Rossoni.
É melhor, Jorge. O professor Marcílio pode fazer o encerramento, né, professor?
Encerramento do YouTube? Como
a transmissão do YouTube, professor.
Eu acho que é só o Amâncio que pode fazer isso.
Se o senhor falar aqui, o Jorge passa o senhor para o YouTube.
Eu posso falar também.
Ok.
Não,
Marcelo, eu vou pegando o pessoal do chat, tá bem?
Por favor.
Vamos encerrar, então, a transmissão no YouTube. Gostaríamos de agradecer a presença de todos. Muito obrigado. E quem quiser vir para a sala do Zoom, tem um link ali na descrição. Muito obrigado a presença de todos.
Marcelo, por favor, é a Karina, tudo bem?